Good evening and welcome to Bedtime Sleep Story. Tonight, let us settle in together and drift slowly north into the quiet world of the Vikings, across cold blue fjords and green island farms beneath enormous skies. We will glide on a wooden longship over still water at dawn, sit by the fire in a turf-roofed longhouse while snow falls softly outside, and listen as old stories are told of gods and giants and far green lands across the sea. These were a people of farmers and sailors, of weavers and storytellers who lived close to the wind and the water and the turning of the seasons. There is nothing here to fear and nothing to hurry for. The longships have all long since come home or settled gently into the earth, and we are only quiet visitors, drifting through their world at evening as the lamps are lit and the day's work is laid down. If these gentle journeys help you rest, a soft like or a follow lets other tired minds find this peaceful place too. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Loosen your shoulders, let your eyes grow heavy, and let the cares of the day drift away like mist off a quiet fjord. And as the last light fades over the northern sea, let us begin. The word Viking describes something people did more than who they were. We use the word Viking as if it were the name of a whole people. Yet, in the old northern tongue, it meant something closer to a voyage or an act of going raiding and trading overseas. To go off on such a journey was to go Viking, and only some of the northern folk ever did so. Most were quiet farmers, fishers, and craftspeople who never left their home valleys at all. To imagine the Viking world rightly, then, is to picture not a land of fierce warriors, but a scattering of small green farms and fishing villages along the cold coasts, from which a few, in summer, sailed away over the sea, while most stayed home to mind the animals in the fields, living gentle, ordinary lives beneath the wide northern sky. The Vikings came from three northern lands of fjords, forests, and long winters. The people we call the Vikings lived in the lands that are now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, a far northern world of deep sea inlets, dark pine forests, scattered farms, and long, dark winters softened by long, light summers. Theirs was a hard and beautiful country, where the sea was a road and the land gave just enough, and where the seasons swung between months of midnight sun and months of deep snow and starlight. To imagine their homeland is to picture steep, green mountains dropping into still blue fjords, small turf-roofed farms tucked into the folds of the hills, fishing boats drawn up on stony shores, and over it all the great quiet of the north, where on a winter night the whole sky might ripple with soft curtains of colored light. The Viking Age began and ended within a span of about 300 years. The great age of the Vikings, when their ships ranged far across the seas, lasted only about 3 centuries, from the late 700s to the middle of the 1000s, a relatively brief and brilliant chapter in the long story of the North. Before it, the northern folk kept mostly to their own shores. After it, they settled into the more familiar shape of medieval kingdoms. To imagine that age is to picture a few hundred years in which a people of the far north, driven by curiosity and need and skill at sea, reached out across the water to touch a great part of the world, and then, the age passing, drew quietly back into their farms and towns, leaving behind them a memory that would last far longer than the age itself. The true marvel of the Vikings was their ships, swift and beautiful and strong. At the heart of everything the Vikings did was the longship, a long, slender wooden vessel that was among the finest ships of its age, light enough to be carried, shallow enough to glide up a river, and strong enough to cross the open ocean, built of overlapping planks, fastened with care, with a single square sail and rows of oars. It could move with the wind or against it, gliding over the water like a living thing. To imagine a longship at dawn, its carved prow rising gracefully, its sail filling with the morning wind, its long hull slipping silently over calm water as the oars dip and rise together, is to picture the great achievement of the Viking world. A vessel so well made and so lovely that it carried a small northern people to the far edges of the known earth. A longship could sail the deep ocean, yet glide up a shallow river. The cleverness of the longship lay in how it could do two opposite things well. It could ride the great waves of the open sea, and it could float in water only knee-deep, letting it slip far up rivers into the heart of distant lands where deeper ships could never go. This let the Vikings appear where they were least expected and travel where others could not. To imagine such a ship leaving the wide gray ocean behind and turning quietly up a green river, gliding inland between wooded banks, where herons stand in the shallows, carrying its travelers deep into a country by its waterways, is to feel the freedom the longship gave, a freedom of both the open sea and the secret inland rivers. The whole watery map of the world laid open to a single graceful boat. The longships were steered not by a central rudder, but by a great oar on the right side. A Viking ship was guided by a broad steering oar mounted on the right-hand side near the stern, worked by the steersman to turn the vessel. From this old custom comes a word we still use, for the right side of a ship is called the steerboard side to this day, softened over the centuries into starboard. So, a small piece of the Viking world sails on quietly inside our language. To imagine the steersman standing at the stern with his hand on the great steering oar, feeling the pull of the water and guiding the long hull gently through the waves, leaning into the swell as the ship answers to his touch, is to picture the calm skill that lay behind every voyage, and to hear, in a plain word still used by sailors everywhere, a soft echo of those northern ships. The Vikings found their way across open ocean without map or compass. The Vikings crossed vast stretches of open sea with no maps and no magnetic compass. Yet they found their way with remarkable skill, reading the sun and the stars, the colors of the water, the flight of birds, the shapes of waves, and the movement of whales and clouds. Experienced sailors carried in their minds a deep knowledge of the sea's signs. To imagine a steersman far out on the open ocean, no land in sight in any direction, reading his course in the angle of the sun and the wheel of the stars, watching for the birds that fly toward land at evening and the clouds that gather over distant islands, is to feel the quiet mastery of these sailors who trusted not to instruments, but to long experience and patient watching, and so carried their ships safely across the trackless gray water. Legend says they may have used a glowing sunstone to find the sun on cloudy days. There is an old idea hinted at in the sagas and supported by certain crystals found in the north that Viking navigators may have used a special clear stone, a sunstone, which could reveal the position of the hidden sun even on an overcast day by the way it caught the light of the sky. Whether or not it was widely used, the notion is a lovely one. To imagine a navigator on a gray, clouded sea, holding up a clear crystal to the dull sky and turning it slowly until it brightened toward the hidden sun, finding his bearings by a stone that drank the light, is to picture the gentle ingenuity of these sailors, who found in the plain materials of their cold world the means to read the sky and hold their course through the mist. The Vikings were among the first Europeans to reach a green new land they called Iceland. Sailing west across the open ocean, the Vikings came upon a large, empty island of green valleys, hot springs, and smoking mountains, which they settled and named for the ice on its northern shores, though much of it was green and fair. There, they built farms and made a new home in a land no people had lived in before. To imagine those first settlers arriving on the shores of Iceland, their longships drawn up on black sand beaches, looking out over a wide green land of waterfalls and steaming springs and distant snowy peaks, a whole country empty and waiting, theirs to make a home in, is to feel the deep pull of the open frontier, the quiet courage it took to cross the great ocean and begin a new life on the far edge of the world. In Iceland, the Vikings created one of the world's oldest gatherings of the people. The settlers of Iceland, having no king, governed themselves by gathering once a year at a great open-air assembly, where laws were spoken aloud, disputes were settled, and decisions were made together, in one of the earliest lawmaking assemblies of its kind in the world. People came from all over the island to camp, trade, meet friends, and take part. To imagine that yearly gathering in its wide valley ringed by cliffs, hundreds of people camped on the green grass, the law speaker reciting the laws from memory atop a great rock, while the crowd listens, families meeting and trading and telling news beneath the summer sky, is to picture a remarkable thing. A whole people governing themselves by talk and agreement in the open air, gathered together in peace at the heart of their new land. The Vikings reached Greenland and made farms at the very edge of the world. Sailing still further west and north, the Vikings came to a vast, ice-bound land they hopefully named Greenland, and along its softer southern fjords, they built farms and raised their animals at the very rim of the habitable world. For several centuries they lived there, in small green settlements, surrounded by ice and sea, far from any other people. To imagine those distant farms in the brief Greenland summer, turf-walled houses beside a deep fjord, sheep and cattle grazing on the thin green pasture, icebergs drifting silently on the blue water beyond, the great ice cap glittering above, is to picture life lived at the farthest edge of everything. A small warm circle of home and animals and family clinging bravely to the green margin of an immense and frozen land. 500 years before Columbus, the Vikings reached the shores of America. From Greenland, Viking sailors went on still further west and reached the coast of North America, landing on its shores and even building a small settlement there, fully 500 years before any other Europeans would arrive. They called the new land for the wild grapes or vines they found and explored its coasts before turning back. To imagine those Viking explorers stepping onto the shore of a new continent, the first Europeans ever to do so, walking through unfamiliar forests by an unknown sea, gathering timber and grapes, marveling quietly at a land none of their people had ever seen, is to feel the astonishing reach of these northern voyagers, who in their open wooden ships felt their way clear across the ocean to touch the edge of a world that would not be found again for centuries. We know they reached America for certain, because their houses were found there. The proof that the Vikings reached America rests not only on old stories, but on the remains of their own buildings, found long afterward on the northern tip of a great island, where the outlines of turf houses, a smithy, and Viking objects were uncovered, showing without doubt that northern people had lived there. The quiet earth kept the proof safe for 1,000 years. To imagine that small, brief settlement on the far Atlantic shore, a cluster of turf-walled houses by a shallow bay, smoke rising from a forge, a handful of northern folk living for a season or two at the very western edge of their known world before sailing home, and then to picture the grassy mounds that were all that remained, waiting 1,000 years to be found, is to feel the gentle persistence of the past. The Vikings did not only raid, far more of them went out to trade. Though the Vikings are remembered for raiding, in truth, a great deal of their travel was peaceful trade, and they were among the most far ranging merchants of their age, carrying furs, walrus ivory, amber, and other northern goods to distant markets and bringing home silk, silver, spices, and wine. Their trading towns hummed with goods from half the world. To imagine a Viking trading ship riding low in the water under a load of furs and amber, gliding into a busy harbor market where goods from many lands are piled on the wharves, the northern merchants bargaining quietly for silver and silk to carry home, is to picture the calmer and more common face of the Viking abroad. Not the raider, but the trader, weaving the cold north into the great web of the world's commerce. Viking traders traveled the great rivers of the east all the way to a golden city. Some Vikings turned east instead of west, traveling down the long rivers of Eastern Europe in their light ships, carrying and sometimes hauling them over land between waterways until they reached the great wealthy city on the southern sea that they called by their own name, Miklagard, the great city. There they traded, served as honored guards, and marveled at its golden domes. To imagine those northern travelers arriving at last at that shining southern city after their long river journey, gazing up at its great walls and golden churches, so far from the cold fjords of home, trading their northern furs for silk and silver in the markets of the richest city they had ever seen, is to feel how astonishingly far these voyagers ranged, from the frozen north to the warm and gilded heart of the southern world. Vikings even reached the great markets of the distant Islamic world. The eastern traveling Vikings reached not only the great southern city, but through it and along the rivers, the rich markets of the Islamic lands far to the south and east, and vast amounts of silver coins from those distant places have been found buried in Viking lands, proof of a long and busy trade. The cold north and the warm caliphates were quietly linked by the river roads. To imagine those silver coins, stamped with elegant southern writing, traveling all the way north to be buried for safekeeping beneath a farm in a cold fjord land, the wealth of distant deserts resting in the northern earth, is to picture the immense and surprising reach of Viking trade, which stretched a thread of silver clear across the world, joining peoples who can have known almost nothing of one another, save through the goods that passed between them. Most Vikings were not warriors at all, but farmers who loved their land. For all their seafaring fame, the great majority of Viking people spent their lives as farmers, raising barley and oats, keeping cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens, making hay, and working hard through the short growing season to lay up enough food for the long winter. The farm, not the longship, was the true center of their world. To imagine a Viking farm in late summer, the family out in the fields, cutting and drying the hay, cattle grazing on the green slopes, the turf-roofed house with its store of food growing against the coming winter, the whole life of the place turning quietly on the seasons and the animals, is to picture the real and gentle heart of the Viking world, a world of patient farmers, far more than of raiders, bound to their land and their beasts and the turning year. The Viking home was a long, low house, with a fire always burning in his heart. Most Viking families lived in a longhouse, a long building with thick walls of wood, stone, or turf, and a roof of turf or thatch. with a single great room where the family cooked, ate, worked, and slept around a long fire that burned in the center of the floor. The animals were often kept at one end, their warmth helping to heat the house. To imagine the inside of a longhouse on a winter night, the long fire glowing in the middle of the dim room, the family gathered close in its light, the smell of wood smoke and stew, the soft sounds of the animals at the far end, the snow piling silently against the turf walls outside, is to feel the deep, simple warmth of the Viking home, a single fire-lit room holding a whole family safe against the cold and dark of the northern winter. The longhouse fire was never allowed to go out. In the Viking home, the fire on the hearth was precious and was kept burning day and night, banked carefully at bedtime so that its embers might be coaxed back to flame in the morning. For to light a fresh fire was slow and hard work. The hearth fire was the warm, living heart of the house, around which all life turned. To imagine that fire kept faithfully through the long nights, the last person awake gently covering the embers to keep them glowing till dawn. The first one up in the cold morning breathing them softly back to life. The same fire warming the same family through season after season is to feel how much a simple flame could mean in that cold world. A small, constant warmth, tended like a member of the family, never quite allowed to die. Viking nights were long, and so the people became great tellers of stories. Through the long, dark winters of the north, when the sun barely rose and the snow lay deep, Viking families gathered around the fire and passed the long evenings telling stories, reciting poems, and sharing the old tales of gods and heroes and far-off voyages. Storytelling was a treasured art, and a good teller was honored. To imagine a longhouse on a deep winter night, the family and perhaps a visiting traveler gathered close around the fire, a skilled storyteller weaving a long tale of gods and giants and brave deeds, while the listeners sit wrapped and the wind moans outside, is to picture the gentle warmth at the center of Viking life, the way they turned the long darkness into a time of stories, filling the cold nights with the bright living words of their imagination. The Vikings wrote not with letters, but with angular marks called runes. The Vikings had their own writing, an alphabet of straight, angular marks called runes, well suited to being carved into wood, stone, or bone. They used runes to mark ownership, to remember the dead on standing stones, to send messages, and sometimes for charms and blessings. The sharp lines were made for cutting, not for flowing ink. To imagine a Viking carefully carving runes into a smooth piece of wood or a tall gray stone, each angular letter cut with a knife or chisel, recording a name, a memory, or a wish, is to picture the quiet, careful way these people set down their words, not with pen and parchment, but with blade and stone, leaving marks so deep and hard that many of them can still be read today, their straight lines speaking softly across 1,000 years. Tall carved stones still stand in the north, raised in loving memory of those who died. Across the Viking lands stand thousands of tall stones, carved with runes and with beautiful twining patterns of beasts and serpents, raised by families to remember loved ones who had died, often those lost far away on voyages. The runes upon them speak simple, tender words. A father remembering a son, a wife, a husband. To imagine one of these stones standing in a green northern field, its surface carved with graceful interlacing animals and a line of runes, recording a name and a love, raised 1,000 years ago by grieving hands and standing patiently ever since through all the seasons, is to feel the deep human tenderness of the Viking world. A people who, for all their fierce reputation, took such care to carve their love for the dead into stone that would outlast them by 1,000 years. Viking ships were sometimes buried whole, as splendid graves for the great. The Vikings sometimes honored their most important dead by burying them in a ship, drawn up on land and filled with treasures, food, and goods for the journey to the next world, then covered over with a great mound of earth. Some of these ship graves have been found, their wooden vessels astonishingly preserved. To imagine one of these burials, a beautiful longship hauled up from the water and laid in the earth, filled with fine things and covered with a green mound, sleeping there through the centuries with its carved prow intact, and then to picture it uncovered at last, the whole graceful ship rising again from the soil where it had rested 1,000 years, is to feel the grandeur and the strange gentleness of how the Vikings sent off their greatest dead, giving them a ship to carry them onward into the dark. One buried ship was so perfectly kept that we can see the Vikings' own carvings. Among the ship graves uncovered in the north, one held a longship so wonderfully preserved by the wet sealing earth that its elegant carved prow, its timbers, and even small wooden objects buried with it survived almost whole, letting us see the very artistry of Viking hands. Carved animals twine across its wood in flowing, intricate patterns. To imagine that ship as it was found, lifted gently from the dark earth after 1,000 years, with its graceful lines unbroken and its carvings still sharp, the work of long-dead craftsmen suddenly visible again, every twining beast and curling line exactly as they had cut it, is to feel the quiet thrill of meeting the Vikings through their own beautiful work, reaching across the centuries to admire what their patient hands once made. The Vikings believed in a whole family of gods, ruled by the wise one-eyed Odin. The Vikings worshipped many gods, and the chief among them was Odin, a wise and mysterious god of poetry, knowledge, and magic, who was said to have given one of his own eyes in exchange for wisdom and to wander the world in a wide hat and cloak, gathering knowledge. He was both a king of the gods and a restless seeker. To imagine Odin as the Vikings pictured him, a tall cloaked figure with a single piercing eye and a long gray beard, two ravens on his shoulders and a wide hat shadowing his face, wandering the 9 worlds in search of wisdom, is to picture the deep and thoughtful heart of Viking belief, a chief god honored not only for power, but for the patient, costly search for understanding, willing to give up an eye for the gift of seeing more deeply into things. On Odin's shoulders sat 2 ravens, who flew out each day to bring him news of the world. The Vikings told that Odin kept 2 ravens named Thought and Memory, who flew out across the whole world each morning and returned each evening to whisper into his ears all that they had seen, so that the wise god might know everything that happened in the 9 worlds. The ravens were his eyes upon the earth. To imagine those 2 black birds setting out at dawn from the god's shoulders, flying far over mountains and seas and the homes of people and gods, seeing all the doings of the world, and returning at dusk to murmur their news quietly into Odin's ears, is to picture the gentle imagination of the Vikings, who pictured even a great god's knowledge of the world, coming softly home each evening on the wings of 2 faithful birds. Like thoughts and memories returning at the end of a long day, the thunder god Thor was beloved most of all, protector of farmers and homes. Though Odin was the chief of the gods, the one most loved by ordinary Viking people was Thor, the strong, red-bearded god of thunder who carried a great hammer and protected both gods and humans from the giants and the forces of chaos. Friendly, honest, and mighty, He was the guardian of the common folk, and thunder was the sound of his chariot crossing the sky. To imagine Thor as the Vikings loved him, a powerful, good-hearted god with a flaming red beard, riding his chariot across the storm clouds with his great hammer in hand, watching over the farms and families below, is to picture the warm and homely side of Viking faith. For the god they cherished most was not the distant and mysterious one, but the strong, reliable protector, the one who kept the storms and the giants away from the door. Thor's mighty hammer was worn as a small charm for protection and blessing. So beloved was Thor that many Vikings wore a small hammer-shaped pendant around their necks, a charm in the shape of his great weapon, worn for protection and good fortune, and as a sign of their faith. Many of these little hammers have been found in the north, worn smooth by long handling. To imagine a Viking wearing such a small silver or iron hammer on a cord at the throat, touching it for comfort and protection before a voyage or in a storm, the tiny image of the thunder god's weapon kept close against the heart, is to feel the warm, personal nature of their belief. The way a great god could be carried in something small and held in the hand, a little token of strength and safety, worn quietly through the dangers and the ordinary days of a northern life. The Vikings imagined the whole universe as a great tree joining 9 worlds. At the center of all things, the Vikings believed, stood a vast and ancient tree, an immense ash whose roots and branches held together 9 different worlds, including the home of the gods, the world of people, and the lands of giants and the dead. Beneath its roots lay wells of wisdom, and creatures lived among its branches. To imagine that great world tree, as the Vikings pictured it, an enormous ash rising through the whole of creation, its roots sunk in deep wells of memory and fate, its branches spreading over 9 worlds, an eagle in its crown and a serpent at its foot, all of existence held together in one living tree, is to picture the deep poetry of the Viking imagination, which saw the entire universe not as a cold machine, but as a single great living tree, rooted and growing and quietly alive. Brave warriors who fell were thought to feast in Odin's golden hall of Valhalla. The Vikings believed that warriors who died bravely might be carried to a great golden hall called Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where they would feast and rest and prepare for a final battle at the end of the world. It was a place of honor and plenty, with a roof of shields and endless feasting. To imagine that hall as the Vikings dreamed it, vast and golden and warm, its roof made of bright shields, its long tables crowded with brave companions, feasting together in fire-lit good fellowship, the fallen given rest and honor, and the company of heroes, is to picture the comfort the Vikings offered their dead, the gentle hope that those lost bravely were not simply gone, but gathered into a warm, bright hall, resting and feasting among friends until the world should need them once more. The warrior maidens called Valkyries were thought to choose who came to that hall. The Vikings told of the Valkyries, fierce and beautiful warrior women, who rode across the sky and over battlefields, choosing which of the fallen would be carried to Odin's golden hall, then serving the heroes there at their endless feast. They were figures of awe, half guardian and half guide to the next world. To imagine the Valkyries as the Vikings pictured them, riding through the clouds and over the world's edge, gently lifting the spirits of brave fallen warriors, and bearing them up to the warm hall above, then moving among the long tables to fill the cups of the resting heroes, is to picture the tender thread woven even through the Vikings' fiercest beliefs. The idea that death in its moment was met not by emptiness, but by these bright riders, come to carry the worthy gently home. The Vikings believed even the gods would one day face the end of the world. In a striking and solemn belief, the Vikings held that the world as they knew it would one day end in a great final reckoning. When the gods themselves would fall, the old order would be swept away, and the world would sink into sea and fire, only to rise again, green and new, with a few survivors to begin afresh. It was a story of ending and gentle rebirth. To imagine that great myth, the old world passing away in storm and flood, the long feared end arriving at last, and then, out of the dark water, a new green earth rising clean and fresh, a man and a woman who had sheltered through it all, stepping out to begin the world again, is to feel the deep wisdom in the Viking imagination, which faced even the end of all things, with a quiet faith that after every ending comes, in time, a new and gentle beginning. The Viking stories were gathered long after into books called the sagas. Much of what we know of the Viking world and its tales comes from the sagas, long prose stories written down in Iceland in the centuries after the Viking Age, telling of families, feuds, voyages, settlers, and kings in a plain, vivid, unhurried style. They preserve the memory of the old world in words. To imagine those stories being written down at last by lamplight in an Icelandic farmhouse, generations after the events they told of, the long memory of a people set down on calfskin pages in calm, clear words so that it would not be lost, is to feel our quiet debt to those patient writers who gathered up the fading tales of their ancestors and wrote them carefully down, and so handed the whole rich world of the Vikings gently forward to us across the centuries. Viking women held more freedom and respect than women in many lands of that age. In the Viking world, women had rights and a standing unusual for their time. They could own property, run farms, ask for divorce, and hold real authority within the household. And when the men were away at sea or trading, women often managed the whole farm and its workers. They were respected partners in the life of the home. To imagine a Viking woman with the keys to the household at her belt, managing the farm, the stores, and the workers through the long months while her husband was away over the sea, her word carrying real weight in the family and the community, is to picture a society that, for all its hardness, gave its women a measure of freedom and respect that was rare in that age, recognizing them as capable partners in the difficult work of surviving in the North. A Viking woman carried the keys of the home as a sign of her authority. In a Viking household, the woman of the house often wore a set of keys at her belt, the keys to the chests and storerooms where the family's food, cloth, and valuables were kept, and these keys were a visible sign of her authority and her central place in the running of the home. To hold the keys was to hold real power in the family. To imagine a Viking woman moving about her longhouse with the keys chiming softly at her waist, unlocking the chests of grain and wool and treasure, overseeing the stores that would carry the family through the winter, her authority quietly displayed in the keys she carried, is to picture the dignity of her role. For in a world where surviving the winter depended on careful keeping, the one who held the keys to the stores held a power as real and as honored as any. Viking clothes were spun, dyed, and woven by hand, often in cheerful colors. The Vikings did not dress in dull gray and brown, as we might imagine, but in clothing woven from wool and linen, and often dyed in bright, cheerful colors, reds and blues and yellows and greens drawn from plants, with fine trim and ornaments. for those who could afford them. Making cloth was a huge and constant labor, mostly done by women. To imagine a Viking family in their everyday clothes, not drab at all, but warm with color, woolen tunics and dresses dyed in soft reds and blues, trimmed with woven bands and fastened with bronze brooches, all of it spun and woven and dyed by patient hands at home, is to picture a brighter and more cheerful world than we often suppose. A people who, even in their cold land, loved color and took pride in the cloth they made through long hours of careful work. Making cloth was so much work that a single sail could take years to weave. Spinning and weaving were endless labor in the Viking world, and the cloth needed for a single ship's great sail required an enormous amount of wool and a vast number of hours at the loom, so that making one sail might take several people the better part of a year or more. The sails that carried the Vikings across the sea were woven slowly by hand at home. To imagine the women of a community working for months and years at their looms to weave the huge woolen sail for a single longship, thread by thread and row by row. The patient labor of countless quiet hours, folded at last into the great square sail that would catch the ocean wind, is to feel how much hidden, gentle work lay behind every famous voyage, how the longships sailed, in a sense, on the patient weaving of the women at home. The Vikings kept themselves remarkably clean, bathing and grooming with care. Contrary to their rough reputation, the Vikings were notably clean for their age, bathing regularly, washing their hands and faces, and grooming their hair and beards with combs, tweezers, and ear cleaners, many of which have been found in their graves. They valued a neat appearance and took care over it. To imagine a Viking on a quiet morning combing out his hair and beard with a finely made antler comb, washing in cold, clear water, taking real care over his grooming, the combs and small tools of cleanliness kept close at hand, is to picture a people far tidier than legend suggests, who, even in their hard northern world, took the time to keep themselves clean and well groomed, finding in that simple care a small daily dignity beneath the cold sky. A favorite Viking comb was made from the antler of a deer. Among the most common personal belongings of the Vikings were combs, beautifully made from antler or bone, carved and often decorated, and carried everywhere for keeping the hair and beard neat and free of tangles and pests. So many have been found that the comb seems almost a symbol of Viking daily life. To imagine a Viking's antler comb, carved with patient skill from the shed antler of a deer, its fine teeth cut by hand, carried for years in a pouch, and used each morning, a small, useful, lovingly made thing held in the hand at the start of every day, is to feel the quiet ordinariness of Viking life behind all the tales of voyages and gods, the simple human routines of washing and combing and caring for oneself that filled the calm mornings of that distant world. The Vikings loved games and spent long winter evenings at boards and dice. When the work was done, the Vikings enjoyed games to pass the long evenings, including board games played with carved pieces on marked boards, games of strategy where one side defended a king and the other attacked, as well as dice and games of skill. Such games filled the dark hours with friendly contest. To imagine a Viking family or a group of friends gathered by the fire on a winter night, bent over a wooden game board with its carved pieces, one player defending a little king while another tries to surround him. The quiet talk and laughter of the game filling the warm room while the snow falls outside is to picture the gentle leisure of the Viking world, the simple pleasure of a game by the fire, a small bright contest of wits to warm the long northern evenings. The Vikings made beautiful jewelry of silver, gold, bronze, and glass. The Vikings loved fine ornaments and were skilled metalworkers, making brooches, arm rings, neck rings, pendants, and beads of silver, gold, bronze, and colorful glass, often worked in intricate patterns of twining beasts. Such jewelry was both beautiful and a way of carrying one's wealth. To imagine a Viking craftsman bent over his work, shaping a brooch of silver into a knot of twining animals, setting bright glass beads into a necklace, the firelight glinting on the precious metal as the delicate pattern slowly takes shape, is to picture the love of beauty that ran through the Viking world. A people who, for all the hardness of their lives, delighted in fine and intricate things and adorned themselves with ornaments made with real artistry and care from the silver and gold their travels brought home. Viking silver was so trusted that they often paid by weight in chopped pieces. In much of the Viking world, silver was valued by its weight rather than by coin, and so the Vikings often paid for goods with pieces of silver weighed on small scales, chopping up arm rings, coins, and ornaments into bits to make the right amount. Many such hoards of chopped silver, called hack silver, have been found buried. To imagine a Viking merchant in a market taking out his small folding scales and a pouch of silver bits, snipping a piece from a silver arm ring to balance the weight of his purchase, paying not in counted coins but in carefully weighed metal, is to picture the practical, portable way the Vikings carried and used their wealth, turning even their jewelry into money when needed, and burying their chopped silver in the earth for safekeeping, where some of it waited 1,000 years to be found. The Vikings buried their treasure in the ground, and some still lies waiting. In times of danger, or simply for safekeeping, Vikings often buried their silver and treasure in the ground, meaning to dig it up again later, and those who never returned left their hoards hidden in the earth, some of which are still being found today by lucky searchers. Each buried hoard is a small frozen moment of a life. To imagine a Viking long ago kneeling in a quiet field at dusk, bearing a pouch of silver coins and chopped ornaments for safety, meaning to return for it but never doing so, and then to picture that little hoard waiting patiently in the dark soil for 1,000 years until a stranger's spade uncovers it at last, is to feel the quiet human stories hidden in the earth, the saved up wealth of ordinary people kept safe by the ground long after the savers themselves were gone. The Vikings founded great cities that still thrive today, like Dublin. Wherever the Vikings settled, they often founded or grew towns that became important trading centers, and some of these have grown into great cities of the present day, including the capital of Ireland, which began as a Viking settlement by a dark pool on a river. The Vikings were town builders as well as farmers and sailors. To imagine the beginnings of such a city, a cluster of Viking houses and workshops growing up around a sheltered harbor, busy with traders and craftsmen, ships coming and going with goods from far away, the small settlements slowly thickening into a town and then, over the centuries, into a great city, is to feel the lasting mark the Vikings left upon the map. For some of the busy cities of today first took root as small northern trading posts 1,000 years ago. In England, the Vikings ruled a great region with its capital at the city of York. For a long time, the Vikings held sway over a large part of England, governing it by their own laws, in a region whose memory lingers in place names to this day, with their northern capital at the city they called Jorvik, which we now know as York. There they traded, farmed, and made their homes. To imagine that Viking city of Jorvik in its busy days, its streets crowded with craftsmen working leather and metal and bone, its harbor full of trading ships, the smell of wood smoke and the sound of many trades filling the lanes, a thriving northern town, set down in the heart of England, is to picture how thoroughly the Vikings settled and built where they went. Not merely raiding, but living, working, and raising families, leaving behind them towns and laws and words that endure in England still. Hundreds of English words come quietly to us from the Vikings. The Vikings who settled in England left their mark deep in the English language, and hundreds of everyday words come to us from the old northern tongue, plain and useful words we use without a thought, the very words we use for sky, for window, for egg and knife, and many another homely thing carry within them the soft echo of the Vikings. To imagine all those northern words woven invisibly through our daily speech, each one carried to England by a Viking settler 1,000 years ago and kept ever since, so that we speak a little of the Vikings' own language every day without ever knowing it, is to feel how the Vikings live on, not only in stones and ships and stories, but in our very mouths, in the plain old words we use to name the simple things of life. Even the days of our week are named for the Vikings' gods. So deeply did the northern peoples mark our world that several days of our week still carry the names of their gods. For the chief gods of the Old North gave their names to the middle days of the week, which we still speak aloud, all unknowing, every time we name the days. The gods of the Vikings are remembered quietly in our calendars. To imagine that every week, as we name its days, we are softly speaking the names of Odin and Thor and the other old northern gods. Their worship long faded, but their names living on in the plainest rhythm of our lives. The days ticking by under the quiet patronage of gods most of us have forgotten is to feel how the Viking world is woven invisibly into the very structure of our time, present every week in the names we never think to question. The Vikings ate simple, hearty food, bread, stew, fish, and porridge. The food of the Vikings was plain and filling, suited to a hard climate. Coarse bread, porridge of oats or barley, stews of meat and vegetables, fish both fresh and dried, cheese and milk from their animals, and what fruit and nuts and honey the land provided. Most meals were cooked in a single pot over the hearth fire. To imagine a Viking meal on a winter evening, a great pot of a hearty stew bubbling over the fire, dark bread and cheese set out, dried fish and a little ale, the family gathered to eat together in the warm firelight after the day's work, is to picture the simple, satisfying heart of their daily life. Food that was nothing fancy but warm and filling and shared in good company, the plain nourishment that carried these northern people through their long, cold, hard-working lives. The Vikings preserved fish by drying it hard in the cold sea wind. To keep fish through the long winter, the Vikings hung it up to dry in the cold, clean sea air until it became hard and light and would keep for a very long time. A method so good that dried fish became an important food and even a valuable trade good carried to distant lands. The cold north wind was their larder. To imagine rows of split fish hanging on wooden racks by the shore in the cold, bright air, slowly drying hard in the wind off the sea, a winter's worth of food being quietly prepared by the patient work of wind and cold, is to picture the careful, practical wisdom of the Vikings, who learned to use their harsh climate itself to preserve their food, turning the very cold that threatened them into the means of keeping fed through the dark and hungry months of winter. The Vikings brewed ale and mead and shared them at their feasts. The Vikings made and enjoyed ale, brewed from barley and mead made from fermented honey, sweet and strong. And these drinks were shared at feasts and gatherings, poured into horns and cups, and passed in good fellowship. A feast with plenty of drink and food was a sign of a generous host. To imagine a Viking feast in a longhouse, the fire bright and the tables full, horns of ale and mead passing from hand to hand, the host generous and the guests merry, songs and stories and laughter filling the warm hall while the cold night presses against the walls outside, is to picture the warm, sociable heart of Viking life, for these were people who loved good company and a generous table, and who turned the gathering of friends around food and drink into one of the great pleasures of their hard northern world. A great feast in the hall was the warm heart of Viking community life. The feast in the chieftain's hall was a central event of Viking life, a time when the community gathered to eat, drink, exchange gifts, settle matters, hear poetry, and strengthen the bonds between people. A good chieftain was a generous one, and giving freely at feasts was the mark of a worthy leader. To imagine such a feast, the long hall warm and bright, the chieftain seated at the high place giving gifts of arm rings and fine things to his followers, the tables loud with talk and laughter, a poet reciting verses of praise, the whole community drawn together in warmth and plenty against the dark outside, is to picture the social heart of the Viking world, where leadership meant generosity and community was built and renewed around the shared warmth of the feasting hall. Viking children grew up quickly, learning the work of the farm and the sea. Viking children had little formal schooling, but learned by doing, helping with the animals and the harvest, learning to spin and weave, to sail and fish, to fight and to keep house, taking on real work from a young age, and growing up close to the life of the farm and the sea. They learned the stories and skills of their people from their elders. To imagine a Viking child at work and play on the farm, helping to feed the animals and bring in the hay, learning to handle a small boat, listening to the old stories by the fire, growing strong and capable in the hard, bracing life of the North, is to picture how the Viking world passed itself on, not through books and schools, but through the daily sharing of work and skill and story between the old and the young, generation after generation. Viking children played with toys, much like children everywhere and always. The children of the Vikings, for all the hardness of their world, played with toys we would recognize, little carved wooden boats and horses, balls, and small weapons, and small versions of the tools and animals of grown-up life found in graves and settlements across the north. Children were children then as now. To imagine a Viking child playing by the longhouse with a little carved wooden boat, sailing it in a puddle as the grown-ups sail real ships on the sea, or galloping a small wooden horse across the floor, the same simple joys of play that children have always known, is to feel the tender thread that joins us to that distant world. For beneath all the differences of time, a child playing with a little wooden boat by the fire is a sight as familiar and as dear as any in the world. The Vikings loved fine craftsmanship, working wood, metal, bone, and leather with skill. The Vikings were highly skilled craftspeople, working wood into ships and houses and carved ornaments, metal into tools and weapons and jewelry, and bone, antler, and leather into countless everyday things, often decorated with beautiful flowing patterns. Good craftsmanship was admired and valued throughout their world. To imagine the workshops of a Viking town, a woodcarver shaping a graceful prow, a smith hammering glowing iron, a jeweler setting bright beads, a comb maker cutting the fine teeth of an antler comb, all of them working with patient skill and decorating even ordinary things with care, is to picture a people who took deep pride in making things well, who turned the plain materials of their world, wood and bone and metal, into objects that were not only useful, but often genuinely beautiful, made to last and to please the eye. Viking art was full of twining, interlacing animals that flowed across every surface. The art of the Vikings was unmistakable, a flowing, interlacing style of twining beasts and serpents whose long bodies wound and gripped and looped across the surfaces of brooches, ship prows, carved stones, and wooden objects in endless, intricate patterns. It was an art of movement and pattern, rather than of plain pictures. To imagine that art covering a Viking craftsman's work, long-limbed beasts and serpents twining together in graceful, complicated knots, that the eye can follow round and round without ever finding an end, the whole surface alive with flowing, gripping animal forms, is to picture the distinctive beauty of the Viking eye, which loved not stillness but motion, not simple shapes but rich, woven, endlessly turning patterns, and pressed that love of intricate flowing line into nearly everything they made. The Vikings raised tall memorial stones carved with both pictures and runes. Beyond their carved animal patterns, the Vikings raised great stones decorated with whole scenes, ships under sail, riders, gods, and stories from their myths, alongside lines of runes telling in stone both the deeds of the dead and the tales of their gods. These picture stones are like illustrated pages set up in the open air. To imagine one of these tall stones standing in a green field, its surface carved with a longship full sail upon a stone sea, with riders and figures from the old stories, and a border of runes recording a name, the whole thing painted once in bright colors now long weathered away, is to picture how the Vikings turned standing stones into lasting memorials and storybooks at once, setting up in the landscape great carved pages that still speak, 1,000 years later, of their dead and their gods. The Vikings reached and settled the far northern islands of the cold Atlantic. Beyond their homelands, the Vikings sailed out and settled the scattered islands of the northern seas, the wild, windswept, treeless isles of the cold Atlantic, building farms on their green slopes and living by sheep, fish, and the sea in some of the most remote and beautiful places in Europe. Their descendants live in some of these islands still. To imagine a Viking farm on one of those far northern islands, a turf house low against the wind on a green slope above a gray sea, sheep grazing on the steep pasture, seabirds wheeling over the cliffs, the nearest other land far across the water, is to picture the astonishing reach and hardiness of the Vikings, who made homes even on the loneliest specks of green in the northern ocean, and found in those wild, beautiful islands a place to live close to the sea and the wind and the wide gray sky. A Viking settlement in Normandy gave its very name to that French land. Some Vikings settled in northern France, where they were granted a region that took its name from them, the land of the Northmen, which we now call Normandy. And there they settled, married, took up the local tongue and ways, and became in time a powerful people of their own. The Viking blood ran on quietly into the heart of France. To imagine those Viking settlers making their homes along the green rivers of northern France, slowly setting aside the longship for the plow and the castle, learning the local speech, marrying into the local families, their fierce northern energy flowing into a new land that took its very name from them, is to picture how the Vikings, wherever they settled, did not only conquer, but blended in, putting down roots so deep that whole regions still carry their name and their inheritance to this day. In the East, Vikings helped found the great state of the Rus, the root of Russia. The Vikings who traveled the eastern rivers settled among the peoples there and helped to found powerful trading states. And from these, and from the name by which some of these northern traders were known, comes, many believe, the very name of Russia. The river roads of the East carried the Viking story deep into another world. To imagine those Eastern Vikings settling in the great riverlands, building trading towns along the waterways, mixing with the local peoples, and helping to found states that would grow into mighty nations, their northern name passing on to a vast land far from the fjords, is to feel once more how widely the Vikings spread their influence, reaching not only west to America and south to the Golden City, but east into the heart of a continent where their name lived on in a great country they helped to begin. The Vikings' reach stretched in all across a great part of the known world. If we gather up all their voyages, the Vikings touched an astonishing sweep of the world, from America in the west to the rivers of Russia and the markets of the Islamic lands in the east, from the cold Arctic islands in the north to the warm southern sea. A reach remarkable for any people, and astonishing for one so few in number, and from so remote a corner of the earth. To imagine the whole span of the Viking world laid out at once, the longships threading from the green coast of America across the wide Atlantic to the fjords of home, and on through the rivers of the east to the golden southern city and the silver of distant deserts, is to picture the immense and surprising reach of these northern voyagers who from their small, cold homeland felt their way outward to touch nearly the whole of their known world. The Vikings traveled with their animals, even carrying horses and cattle by ship. When the Vikings sailed out to settle new lands, they did not go empty-handed, but carried with them the animals they would need, loading horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens aboard their ships to begin new farms across the sea. The descendants of these animals live on in the lands they settled to this day. To imagine a Viking ship setting out to settle a new island with its decks crowded, not only with people and goods, but with patient animals, horses, and sheep, standing braced against the roll of the sea, carried bravely across the open ocean to begin a new life on a distant green shore, is to picture the careful, hopeful work of settlement. For the Vikings sailed out not merely to raid and return, but to make new homes, and so carried with them across the sea the very animals on which a farming life depends. A sturdy little horse the Vikings brought to Iceland still runs there today. The Vikings brought their hardy horses to Iceland over 1,000 years ago, and because the island was so isolated, that same breed of small, strong, gentle horse lives there still almost unchanged, one of the oldest and purest horse breeds in the world, beloved for its sure feet and friendly nature. A living piece of the Viking world still grazes the Icelandic hills. To imagine those small, sturdy horses on the green slopes of Iceland, their thick manes blowing in the wind, descended in an unbroken line from the horses the first Vikings carried across the sea, still carrying riders over the same rough country 1,000 years later, is to feel the gentle continuity of the Viking world. For in those friendly little horses, something of the Vikings themselves lives on, hardy and patient, and entirely at home in the north. The Vikings honored their word with solemn oaths, often sworn on a sacred ring. In a world without written contracts, the Vikings set great store by the spoken oath, and important promises and agreements were sealed with solemn oaths, sometimes sworn upon a sacred ring kept for the purpose, for to break such an oath was a deep and shameful thing. A person's word and honor were their most precious possessions. To imagine two Vikings sealing an agreement with a solemn oath, perhaps laying their hands upon a sacred arm ring, swearing before their companions to keep faith, knowing that their honor and their good name depended on holding to their word, is to picture how trust was built and kept in the Viking world, not by paper and seal, but by the weight of the spoken promise and the deep value these people placed on honor, on being known as one whose word could be trusted utterly. Disputes among the Vikings were often settled by law and assembly, not by the sword. Though the Vikings are remembered for fighting, they had a strong sense of law, and many disputes were brought before assemblies where they were judged according to custom, with compensation paid to settle wrongs, in an effort to keep peace within the community. Law and the assembly were meant to hold violence in check. To imagine a Viking assembly judging a dispute, the people gathered to hear both sides, the law recited from memory, a fair settlement worked out, and compensation agreed so that a quarrel need not become a feud. The community using its shared law to keep the peace is to picture the ordered side of the Viking world, often forgotten beneath the tales of raiding, a society that valued law and worked hard through its assemblies and customs to settle its troubles with words and fair payment rather than with the sword. The Vikings measured their year by the swing between long darkness and endless light. Living so far north, the Vikings knew a year of great extremes, with winters of long darkness when the sun barely rose, and summers of endless light when it scarcely set, and their whole life turned upon this swing. The dark months for indoor work and stories, the light months for farming, sailing, and travel. The rhythm of light and dark shaped everything. To imagine a Viking summer night when the sun dips only briefly below the horizon and the sky never fully darkens, the long golden dusk in which the work of the farm and the voyages of the ships went on, and then the deep winter when darkness swallowed the short days, is to feel how closely the Vikings lived to the great turning of light and dark, their year a long breath between two extremes, sailing and working in the endless summer light, resting and telling stories through the long winter night. On winter nights, the Vikings watched the great colored lights ripple across the sky. In the long darkness of the northern winter, the Vikings beheld one of the most beautiful sights in all the world, the great shifting curtains of colored light that ripple across the polar sky, glowing green and red and violet in the cold dark. They wove this wonder into their stories and their sense of the world. To imagine a Viking standing outside the longhouse on a clear, freezing winter night, looking up to see the whole sky alive with vast, rippling curtains of soft green and rose light, silently shifting and dancing overhead above the dark land and the still fjord, is to picture one of the quiet glories of their world. For these people of the far north lived beneath a sky that, on the coldest nights, could fill itself with silent, drifting fire, a wonder freely given to brighten the long darkness. The Vikings built their houses of whatever the land gave, wood, stone, or living turf. The Vikings built their homes from whatever materials their land offered, using timber where forests grew, stone where it was plentiful, and thick blocks of turf cut from the grassy earth where wood was scarce, so that in some lands their houses were green-roofed and grass-walled, snug and warm against the cold. The turf houses seemed almost to grow from the ground. To imagine a Viking turf house in such land, its walls and roof built of cut sods of earth, so that grass and wildflowers grew upon it, snug and low against the wind, smoke rising from the hearth within, the whole house blending so gently into the green hillside that it seemed a natural part of the land, is to picture the resourcefulness of the Vikings, who, lacking wood, simply built their homes from the living earth itself and made of grass and soil a warm and lasting shelter. The Vikings were guided home across the sea by the birds they carried or watched. Far out on the open ocean, Viking sailors watched the birds for signs of land, knowing that certain birds flew out only so far from shore. And it is told that they sometimes carried birds aboard to release, watching which way they flew, for a bird freed over empty sea would fly toward the nearest land. The birds were living compasses. To imagine a Viking ship far from any shore, the sailors watching the sky, releasing a bird from the deck, and following the line of its flight toward unseen land beyond the horizon, trusting the bird's own longing for the shore to point the way, is to picture the close and observant bond these sailors kept with the natural world, reading the sea and the sky and the flight of birds so carefully that they could find their way across the trackless ocean by the wisdom of the creatures around them. The Vikings were skilled fishers as well as farmers, drawing food from the cold sea. Living close to the sea, the Vikings were expert fishers, taking cod, herring, and other fish from the cold northern waters in great quantities, both to eat fresh and to dry for the winter and for trade. And fishing was as much a part of their life as farming. The sea was a field they harvested as surely as the land. To imagine Viking fishers out on the cold gray water in their boats, hauling in lines and nets heavy with silver fish, the catch that would feed the family through the winter and be traded far away, the patient daily work of drawing food from the sea going on alongside the work of the farm, is to picture how fully the Vikings lived between land and water, taking their living from both, as much fishers of the cold sea as keepers of the Greenland, fed by the patient harvest of the waves. The Vikings hunted the great whale and the walrus of the far north. In the cold northern waters, the Vikings hunted sea creatures including the walrus, prized for its ivory tusks and tough hide, and made use of stranded whales, whose meat, bone, and oil were valuable. Walrus ivory in particular was a treasured trade good, carried far south to be carved into precious things. To imagine the Vikings of the far north hunting the walrus on the ice and the rocky shores, gathering its ivory to trade away to distant lands where it would be carved into fine ornaments and game pieces, drawing wealth as well as food from the harsh Arctic seas, is to picture how the Vikings turned even the bleakest and coldest reaches of their world to use, finding in the walrus and the whale of the frozen north both food for the winter and treasure to carry south, where the ivory of the cold seas was prized as a wonder. Viking ships were given names and treated almost as living things. So beloved and important were their ships that the Vikings often gave them names, frequently grand and poetic ones, and spoke of them with affection and pride, treating these vessels almost as living companions on their voyages. A fine ship was a source of deep pride and even love. To imagine a Viking standing on the shore looking at his ship, drawn up on the beach, its carved prow rising proudly, calling it by the noble name he had given it, feeling for it the pride and affection one might feel for a fine horse or a faithful friend, is to picture the deep bond between the Vikings and their ships. For these vessels were not mere tools, but the very means of their freedom and their fame, carrying them across the world and home again, and so were cherished, named, and loved, almost as living things. A Viking ship's carved prow was often a great curling dragon's head. The prows of the grandest Viking ships were often carved into the shape of fierce, beautiful animal heads, dragons or serpents, their long necks curling up from the bow, splendid to behold and meant in part to awe and frighten. These dragon prows gave the finest ships their fearsome, lovely look. To imagine a great Viking ship under sail, its high prow carved into a magnificent curling dragon's head, rising above the waves, the proud, fierce figure cutting through the gray water at the head of the long, graceful hull, is to picture the most famous image of the Viking world, the dragon ship riding the sea, a vessel made not only to be swift and strong, but to be beautiful and awe-inspiring. Its carved dragon's head lifted proudly into the wind as it carried its people across the wide and dangerous ocean. The Vikings believed strongly in fate, yet faced it with courage and good cheer. The Vikings held a deep belief in fate, feeling that the length of a life and the time of its ending were woven beforehand by mysterious powers. Yet rather than making them gloomy, this belief often gave them courage. For if one's fate was already set, there was no use in fear, and one might as well face whatever came with a brave and cheerful heart. To imagine the Vikings carrying this calm belief, feeling that their fate was already woven and so meeting danger and even death without flinching, throwing themselves into life boldly because worry could change nothing, finding in their fatalism not despair, but a strange freedom and good cheer, is to glimpse something deep in the Viking spirit, a courage rooted in acceptance, a willingness to meet whatever the woven threads of fate might bring with steadiness and even a smile. The threads of every life were thought to be woven by three mysterious women. The Vikings imagined that the fate of each person, and indeed of gods in the world, was spun and woven by three mysterious women who sat by a sacred well at the roots of the world tree, measuring out the lives of all. They were powerful beyond even the gods, the keepers of what was, what is, and what must be. To imagine those three figures at the roots of the great tree, quietly spinning and weaving and cutting the threads of every life that is or ever was, tending the sacred well, holding in their patient hands the destinies of gods and people alike, is to picture the deep and solemn poetry at the heart of the Viking view of the world, the sense that behind all the striving of gods and people sat three quiet weavers, calmly working the threads of fate by the still waters at the root of all things. The Vikings believed in many unseen beings sharing the land with them. Beyond their gods, the Vikings believed the world was full of unseen beings, elves and dwarves and land spirits and trolls, who lived in the rocks and rivers and hills around them and could help or harm, and who were treated with care and respect. The land itself felt alive and inhabited. To imagine the Vikings moving through a world they felt to be quietly full of unseen life, leaving small offerings for the spirits of a place, respecting the great stones and old trees where such beings were thought to dwell, sensing presences in the lonely hills and rushing streams, is to picture the rich and living world of the Viking imagination, in which a person was never quite alone in the landscape, but shared the land with a whole hidden population of spirits and beings, to be honored, befriended, and gently kept on good terms. The dwarves of Viking belief were the master smiths who made the gods' treasures. In Viking myth, the dwarves were extraordinary craftsmen who lived underground and forged the greatest treasures of the gods, including the thunder god's mighty hammer, working their magic at hidden forges deep in the earth and stone. They were small but immensely skilled, the makers of wonders. To imagine those mythical dwarves at their hidden forges beneath the mountains, hammering out treasures of impossible beauty and power for the gods, the thunder god's own hammer taking shape in their clever hands by the light of underground fires, is to picture how the Vikings honored the craft of the smith by weaving it into their very myths, imagining that the finest things in all creation were made not by the gods themselves, but by patient, skilled craftsmen at their forges, a quiet tribute to the makers and smiths the Vikings so admired in their own world. The Vikings made music with flutes, lyres, and the simple joy of song. The Vikings made and enjoyed music, playing flutes and pipes, carved of bone and wood, plucking stringed instruments like the lyre, and above all, singing, filling their feasts and their evenings with song and the recitation of poetry set to simple tunes. Music and verse were woven through their gatherings. To imagine a Viking evening filled with music, someone playing a soft tune on a bone flute, another plucking a lyre, voices joining in song or in the chanting of a long poem, the simple, heartfelt music of the North drifting through a firelit hall is to picture the gentler pleasures of the Viking world. For these were people who loved a good song and a well-told verse, who made instruments with their own hands and filled their long evenings not only with stories, but with the simple, warming joy of music shared among friends. Viking poetry was so prized that a skilled poet was honored at the courts of kings. The Vikings deeply admired skillful poetry, and the finest poets, who could compose intricate verses full of clever imagery and wordplay, were honored figures, welcomed and rewarded at the courts of chieftains and kings, where they composed poems of praise and remembrance. To be a great poet was to hold a respected and valued place. To imagine such a poet standing before a chieftain in his hall, reciting from memory an intricate poem of praise woven with clever, riddling images, the listeners marveling at his skill with words, the chieftain rewarding him with gold for the gift of his verse, is to picture how highly the Vikings valued the art of language, honoring those who could shape words with skill nearly as much as those who could shape iron or sail the sea, and keeping the poet close as a treasured ornament of the hall. Viking poets called things by riddling names, like the whale road for the sea. The most distinctive feature of Viking poetry was its love of riddling, roundabout names for ordinary things, so that the sea might be called the whale road, a ship, the wave horse, the sky, the giant's skull, and gold, the serpent's bed, in clever images that delighted the listeners. These poetic names are like little riddles folded into the verse. To imagine a Viking poet calling the sea the whale road or the swan path, a ship the horse of the waves, the sun the sky candle, weaving these vivid, riddling images through his poem so that even the plainest things became fresh and strange and beautiful, is to feel the playful, image-loving spirit of Viking poetry, which never simply named a thing if it could find a lovelier, cleverer way to suggest it, and so turned even talk of the sea and the sky into a quiet delight of riddles and pictures. The Vikings' famous horned helmets are, in truth, a later invention. One of the most familiar images of the Vikings, the warrior in a horned helmet, is in fact not historical at all, for the real Vikings wore plain, practical helmets without horns, and the horned helmet was a romantic invention of much later times. The true Viking helmet was a simple, sensible cap of iron. To imagine the real Vikings as they actually were, wearing plain, rounded helmets of iron with perhaps a guard for the nose, sensible and unadorned, and to set this gently against the famous horned helmets of story and stage, is to be reminded how the past is often dressed up by those who come after, and how the real Vikings, practical people who would never have worn anything so awkward as horns into a fight, have been given by later ages a costume they themselves would have found rather strange. A Viking's most prized possession was often a finely made sword, passed down for generations. Among the Vikings, a good sword was a treasure of the highest value, finely forged, beautifully decorated, often named and handed down from father to son through the generations as a family heirloom of great worth and meaning. To own a fine old sword was to carry the honor of one's family in one's hand. To imagine such a sword, its blade patterned by the skill of its making, its hilt worked with silver and gold, given a name and treasured for generations, passing from a grandfather to a father to a son, carrying with it the memory and honor of all who had borne it, is to picture how the Vikings invested their finest objects with deep meaning, so that a sword was not merely a weapon, but a precious link between the generations, a treasured heirloom that bound a family together across time. The Vikings made their iron from the bogs and marshes of their own lands. The Vikings did not mine most of their iron from deep in the earth, but gathered it from a humble source. The soft, iron-rich deposits found in bogs and marshes, which they smelted in small furnaces to make the metal for their tools, weapons, and ships' rivets. The marshes were their quiet ironworks. To imagine the Vikings gathering iron from the bogs, smelting the marsh iron in small clay furnaces with patient labor, drawing the precious metal out of the very wetlands of their homeland to forge the rivets that held their ships together and the tools that worked their farms, is to picture the resourcefulness of these people who found the iron they needed not in grand mines, but in the soft ground of their own bogs, and so made the swords and ships and tools of their world from the humble gifts of the marsh. The Vikings traveled in winter too, gliding over snow and ice on skates and skis. The Vikings did not stop moving when winter came, but traveled over the frozen land on skis and crossed the ice on skates made of bone strapped to their feet, gliding swiftly over snow and frozen water, where in summer they would have sailed. They moved easily through their winter world. To imagine a Viking skiing across the deep snow of a winter forest, or gliding over a frozen lake on bone skates beneath a cold, bright sky, moving swiftly and surely through the white winter land that would have stopped a stranger entirely, is to picture how completely the Vikings were at home in their harsh climate, mastering even the deep snow and the ice, turning the frozen winter into another season for travel, sliding over the white world on skis and skates as easily as they sailed the open sea in summer. The Vikings carried fire carefully and made it with flint, steel, and tinder. Making fire was slow and precious work, and the Vikings carried the means to do it, striking sparks from flint and steel into dry tinder and coaxing them gently into flame, or carrying glowing embers carefully from place to place. Fire was too valuable to lose or waste. To imagine a Viking on a cold journey kneeling to make fire, striking flint against steel again and again until a spark catches in a nest of dry tinder, breathing it softly into a small flame, building it up with care into a warming fire, is to feel how much patient skill lay behind a thing we now take for granted. For in the Viking world, a fire was not made with a careless flick, but coaxed slowly and lovingly from spark and tinder, a small daily miracle of warmth, won by patience in the cold. The Vikings' great age ended gently as they settled into kingdoms and new faith. The age of the Vikings did not end in a single great defeat, but faded gradually as the northern lands grew into settled kingdoms, as their people took up the Christian faith and as the old ways of raiding gave place to the more familiar life of medieval Europe. The Vikings did not vanish, they simply changed. To imagine that slow and gentle ending, the longships drawn up for the last time and left to weather on the shore, the old gods quietly giving way to new churches, the restless sea rovers settling into farmers and townsfolk and subjects of kings, the brilliant Viking age softening imperceptibly into the ordinary life of the medieval North, is to feel how the great chapters of history often close not with a crash, but with a slow and quiet transformation, the Vikings becoming, over a few generations, simply the people of the northern lands. The Vikings became Christian, and their old gods faded slowly into story. Over time, the Vikings gave up the worship of their old gods and became Christians, building churches where they had once honored Odin and Thor. Though the old gods did not vanish entirely, but lived on quietly in the stories, the place names, and the days of the week. The change came gradually, and the old and new lived for a time side by side. To imagine that gentle turning of faith, the first churches rising in the northern lands beside the old sacred places, the old gods slowly stepping back into the realm of story and memory. Even as the new faith took hold, the names of Odin and Thor surviving in tales and in the calendar long after their altars were cold, is to picture how a whole world of belief can soften slowly into legend. The once living gods of the Vikings becoming at last the beloved characters of stories told by their Christian descendants. The descendants of the Vikings still live in the northern lands, much as their ancestors did. The Vikings never truly disappeared. Their descendants live on today in the northern lands and across the world, in the countries the Vikings came from, and the many places they settled, carrying on quietly in their blood and their words and their old place names. The Viking Age ended, but the Viking people simply became the people of the modern North. To imagine the long, unbroken line from the Vikings to their descendants today, the same families farming the same fjords, the same old words on their tongues, the same sea outside their doors, the Viking world flowing on without a break into the present, is to feel that the Vikings are not so distant or so vanished as they seem, but live on in their descendants, going about their lives in the same northern lands their ancestors sailed from 1,000 years ago. The true Vikings have been remembered and misremembered ever since. Ever since their age ended, the Vikings have lived vividly in memory, though often dressed up in legend, imagined as wild-horned warriors, fierce and savage, when the truth was richer and gentler, a people of farmers and traders and poets and explorers, as much as of raiders. The real Vikings were more interesting than the myth. To imagine the gap between the legend and the truth, the storybook Vikings with their horned helmets and endless violence, set beside the real ones with their farms and their poetry, their law courts and their fine combs, their long voyages of trade and settlement, is to feel how easily a people can be flattened by legend into a single fierce image, and how much is gained by looking past it to the fuller, gentler, more human truth of who the Vikings actually were. The Vikings left their mark on the very map in countless names of places. Wherever the Vikings settled, they left their language behind in the names of places, and across the lands they reached, countless towns, villages, islands, and natural features still carry names of Viking origin, quiet reminders on the map of where the northern people once made their homes. The Vikings are written into the landscape itself, To imagine all those Viking place names scattered across the map of the north and beyond, the towns ending in the old northern words for farm or settlement or bay, each one marking a spot where a Viking long ago put down roots and named the land in his own tongue, is to feel how deeply the Vikings are woven into the very ground we walk, their settlements long gone, but their names enduring, so that we still call many a place by the name a Viking gave it 1,000 years ago. The Vikings remind us that even a small, remote people can touch the whole world. Perhaps the most striking thing about the Vikings is that they were so few, a scattering of farmers and fishers from a remote and cold corner of the earth, and yet they reached out to touch a great part of the world through courage, skill at sea, and restless curiosity. They show how far a small people can reach. To imagine that handful of northern folk, never very many, setting out from their cold fjords in their wooden ships to touch America and Russia and the golden southern city and the silver of distant deserts, leaving their mark on the map and the language and the memory of half the world, is to feel the quiet lesson of the Vikings that it is not numbers or riches, but daring, skill, and curiosity that let a people reach far beyond themselves and write their small name large across the world. The Vikings' greatest legacy may simply be their incomparable ships. Of all that the Vikings left behind, perhaps the greatest is the longship itself, one of the most beautiful and capable vessels ever built, a marvel of craft and design that carried a small people across the world and remains 1,000 years later an object of wonder and admiration. The ship was their masterpiece. To imagine a Viking longship even now, reconstructed and sailing once more upon the sea, its graceful hull slipping over the water, its single sail full of wind, moving as silently and beautifully as it did 1,000 years ago, is to feel the enduring power of that great achievement. For the longship was not only the tool of the Viking age, but its finest art, a thing of such beauty and rightness that it still stirs the heart today, the masterpiece of a people who built their greatest art to carry them across the sea. The Vikings' tools and treasures sleep now in quiet museums, telling their story. The everyday things and the treasures of the Vikings, their combs and brooches, their swords and silver, their very ships, rest now in museums across the northern world, where they are studied and admired, each one quietly telling some part of the story of who these people were. The objects speak where the people are silent. To imagine those Viking things resting now under soft museum light, a beautiful brooch, a worn antler comb, a silver hoard, a great reconstructed ship, each one carrying the touch of hands that lived 1,000 years ago, gently telling visitors today of the daily life and the artistry of the Vikings, is to feel how the past speaks to us through the things it left behind, the humble and the splendid objects of Viking life resting quietly now, patient teachers of a world long gone. Every spring, people still gather to remember and relive the Viking world. So strong is the memory of the Vikings that to this day, people gather to celebrate and reenact their world, building replica ships, dressing in Viking clothes, holding festivals, and keeping alive the crafts and stories of the Northern Age, drawn by the enduring fascination of these distant people. The Viking spirit is still warmly remembered. To imagine such a gathering today, people sailing a rebuilt longship, working at the old crafts, telling the old stories around a fire, keeping the Viking world alive not as a dry fact of history, but as a living celebration, is to feel how deeply the Vikings still capture the imagination, how people who sailed away 1,000 years ago can still draw their distant admirers together to remember them with joy, keeping the long memory of the North warm and bright. The Vikings teach us that home and the open road can both be loved at once. There is a gentle wisdom in the shape of the Viking life, which held together two things we often set apart: a deep love of home, of the farm and the family and the warm fire, and a restless love of the open road, of the sea and the voyage and the far horizon. The Vikings cherished both the hearth and the wave. To imagine the Viking poised between these two loves, sailing out in summer to the far edges of the world and returning each autumn to the warm longhouse and the waiting family, holding in one heart both the longing for home and the longing for the horizon, is to feel a deep and human truth in the Viking way, that we need not choose between the comfort of home and the call of the wide world, but may, like the Vikings, love and return to both. The Vikings lived close to nature, reading the sea, the sky, and the seasons. The Vikings lived in the closest possible touch with the natural world, depending on and deeply reading the sea and the wind, the stars and the birds, the turning seasons and the changing light, in a way almost lost to us now. Their survival rested on understanding nature intimately. To imagine the Vikings so finely attuned to their world that they could read a coming storm in the sky, find their way by the stars and the flight of birds, plant and harvest by the subtle turning of the light, and feel the rhythm of the seasons in their bones, is to picture a kind of knowledge we have largely forgotten, a deep and practical intimacy with the natural world, and to feel, perhaps, a quiet longing for it. For the Vikings lived woven into nature in a way that our sheltered modern lives can scarcely imagine. The Vikings remind us how much courage it once took simply to cross the sea. It is easy now to forget what daring it took to do what the Vikings did, to sail out in an open wooden boat across a vast and freezing ocean, out of sight of all land for days or weeks, trusting to skill and courage and a little luck to reach a distant shore. Every voyage was an act of real bravery. To imagine the courage of those sailors setting out across the open Atlantic in an open ship, the cold gray waves all around, no land in any direction, no way to call for help, trusting their lives to their vessel and their seamanship and their hardy hearts, is to feel a deep respect for the Vikings who faced the great ocean with such steadiness and daring, and to be reminded how much courage once lay behind the simple act of crossing the sea to find what lay beyond. The Vikings' world was hard, yet full of warmth, beauty, and good company. For all its hardness, the Viking world was rich in the things that make life warm: the close bonds of family and community, the warmth of the fire and the feast, the beauty of fine craft and poetry, the company of friends through the long winter nights. Theirs was a hard life, but not a cold-hearted one. To imagine the warmth at the center of that hard world, the family gathered close by the fire, the feast loud with friendship, the beautiful things made by loving hands, the stories and songs filling the dark, is to feel that the Vikings, for all the struggle of their lives, knew well how to make warmth and beauty and good company against the cold, and to be reminded that even the hardest life can be filled, if we tend it well, with the simple, deep warmth of love and friendship and beauty shared. The Vikings' stories still speak to us of courage, fate, and the love of life. The old stories of the Vikings, their gods and heroes, Their voyages and their fate still speak to people today, full of courage in the face of a hard and uncertain world, of acceptance of what cannot be changed, and of a deep, brave love of life, lived fully while it lasts. Their tales carry a wisdom that does not fade. To imagine those old stories still being read and loved today, their heroes still facing fate with steady courage, their gods still wise and flawed and human, their deep theme of living bravely and well in a world we cannot control, still speaking quietly to our own hearts, is to feel how the Vikings left us not only ships and silver, but something deeper, a way of facing life and fate with courage and good cheer, folded into stories that still warm and steady us 1,000 years. The whole Viking story can be felt in a single longship gliding home at dusk. If we wish to hold the whole of the Viking world in a single image, we might choose a longship gliding home across a calm fjord at dusk, its sail furled, its oars dipping gently, its carved prow dark against the fading light, bringing its travelers back from far away to the warm fire and the waiting family. In that one picture is the whole of it. To imagine that ship coming quietly home in the long northern dusk, the day's voyaging done, the dark land and the small lit longhouse drawing near, the travelers weary and content, the whole Viking life of voyage and homecoming, of the wide sea and the warm hearth, gathered into one peaceful image, is to hold the entire spirit of the Vikings in a single quiet moment. The brave going out and the gentle coming home that lay at the heart of all they were. And so, the Vikings rest now, their ships long beached beneath the same northern stars. The age of the Vikings is long over now. Their longships beached and turned to earth, their gods softened into stories, their restless voyages ended, and over the quiet fjords and green farms of their homeland stretched the same northern stars and the same soft curtains of light that watched over them so long ago. The Vikings did their daring work, and now they rest. To imagine that whole bright, hardy world at last at peace, the longships sleeping in the earth, the old gods dreaming in their stories, the fjords still and the farms quiet beneath a sky alive with soft, drifting light. The whole brave history of the Vikings, settled gently into the long memory of the North, is to feel the deep rest that follows a life lived fully and well, and to sense, as we ourselves grow drowsy, that after every voyage, however far, there comes at last the quiet harbor and the gentle welcome peace of coming home. And so, as our quiet journey through the world of the Vikings comes gently to its close, let us rest here by the fire as the northern night comes down. Tonight we glided on a longship over still water, sat in a warm turf longhouse while the snow fell, and wandered through their world of farms and fjords, of gods and giants, of far green lands across the sea. We heard the old stories of Odin and Thor and the great world tree, watched the colored lights ripple over the winter sky, and felt the gentle warmth at the heart of that hardy, daring people. There is nothing left to carry now, and nothing left to do. When you are ready, another quiet journey is waiting on the screen, and you can simply let it carry on. A soft follow helps other tired minds find this calm place to rest as well. But for now, let your breathing slow, let your thoughts grow soft and dim, and let yourself drift down into sleep, the way a longship glides at last into a still and sheltered harbor at the end of a long day's sailing. The longships are all at rest now beneath the northern stars, and it is your turn to rest too. Rest well and sweet dreams.